You ever seen a man miss before he even pulls the trigger? The voice cut across the range like dry wind over gravel, sharp, confident, and just loud enough to draw a few smirks from the line of young Marines standing beneath the bleached afternoon sun. The heat shimmered off the desert floor in wavering sheets, bending the horizon into something unreal, and beyond it, steel targets sat silent at distances most of the men here had been struggling to master all morning. Corporal Jake Reynolds lowered his rifle with a casual ease, one eyebrow raised as he looked over his shoulder, the corner of his mouth curled in amusement. A few feet behind him stood the old man. He hadn't spoken yet. He hadn't moved much either. He just stood there in a faded canvas jacket that had seen more years than most of the Marines on that line had been alive, the fabric worn thin at the elbows, the color washed into something between olive and dust. His jeans were plain, his boots scuffed, and on his chest, barely noticeable unless you looked twice, was a small, dull badge pinned crookedly against the fabric. It didn't shine. It didn't demand attention. It simply existed, quiet and out of place among crisp uniforms and polished gear. "Sir, this is a live-fire range," Reynolds said, turning fully now, his tone polite in structure but stripped of any real respect. "Not a museum." A few of the younger Marines chuckled under their breath, the sound low but contagious, rippling down the line as tension gave way to amusement. The old man didn't react to the laughter. His eyes, pale and steady, moved past Reynolds, past the rifles, past the digital wind meters clipped to gear and the spotting scopes mounted on tripods. He was watching the flags. Thin strips of orange fabric staked along the range, fluttering in uneven rhythms, each one telling a slightly different story. The wind wasn't simple today. It moved in layers, shifting direction between ridgelines and dips in the terrain, invisible currents crossing each other in ways that no single instrument could fully capture. Reynolds followed his gaze for a moment, then scoffed lightly. "You lost, old-timer," he added. "Visitor area's back that way, about half a mile." The distance hung there, casual but deliberate, a dismissal disguised as direction. The old man finally shifted his weight, just enough for the gravel beneath his boots to crunch softly. It was the first sound he'd made since stepping onto the range, and it carried further than it should have. "I'm not lost," he said. His voice was low, worn, like something that had been carried a long way and set down carefully. No edge, no challenge, just a statement. Reynolds tilted his head, studying him now with a touch more curiosity, though the smirk never left his face. "Then you're in the wrong place," he replied. "We're running qualification drills. Not exactly beginner-friendly." Another ripple of laughter. Someone farther down the line muttered something about range tourists, earning a few more quiet snickers. The old man let the words pass through the air without resistance. He had heard worse. Much worse. His gaze returned to the flags, then drifted to the distant steel silhouette nearly 1,000 yards out, barely visible through the heat haze. For a moment, his eyes narrowed, not in strain, but in recognition, like he was seeing something familiar beneath the distortion. "Winds crossing twice," he said quietly, almost to himself. "You're reading it as one." Reynolds blinked, caught slightly off guard, then let out a short laugh. "We've got instruments for that," he said, tapping the compact device strapped to his vest. "State of the art. Probably newer than anything you've ever used." The old man gave a faint nod, as if acknowledging the point, though his eyes never left the range. "Maybe," he said. The simplicity of the answer seemed to irritate Reynolds more than any argument could have. He stepped closer, boots grinding into the gravel, closing the distance until the contrast between them was impossible to ignore. Youth and confidence standing inches from age and silence. "Look," Reynolds said, lowering his voice just enough to make it personal. "I don't know what you think you're doing here, but you can't just walk onto a Marine range and start giving advice. That's not how this works." The old man finally looked at him directly. There was no anger in his expression, no defensiveness, just that same steady calm, like a surface that didn't ripple no matter what was thrown at it. "I wasn't giving advice," he said. A brief pause. Then, almost as an afterthought, "I was just asking for a rifle." The words landed softly, but the reaction was immediate. For half a second, there was silence. Then the laughter came louder this time, less restrained, spreading across the line like a spark catching dry brush. Reynolds shook his head, grinning openly now. A rifle, he repeated. You serious? He glanced around at the others, inviting them into the moment, into the joke. You hear that? Grandpa wants to take a shot. More laughter. Louder now. Easier. The kind that builds when a target has been clearly defined. The old man didn't move, didn't flinch. The wind shifted again, tugging at the flags in a different direction, subtle but undeniable. And somewhere in the distance, beyond the heat and the noise, the steel target waited, quiet and unmoving, as if it already knew something the men on the line did not. The laughter lingered longer than it should have, stretching out across the range until it began to lose its edge and settle into something thinner, something almost uncertain, like even the men laughing were not entirely sure why they were still doing it. Corporal Jake Reynolds let the moment breathe, letting the reaction work in his favor, his confidence fed by the attention of the others. But there was a flicker in his eyes now, subtle and quick, the kind that comes when something does not quite fit. The old man had not reacted the way people usually did. No irritation, no embarrassment, not even the quiet retreat that most civilians chose when they realized they had stepped somewhere they did not belong. He had simply stood there, as if the laughter existed somewhere far away from him, as if it had no weight at all. Reynolds shifted his rifle in his hands, adjusting his stance, the movement automatic, practiced, but his attention remained fixed on the man in front of him. You want a rifle, he said again, slower this time, as if testing the words. For what? The old man did not answer. Immediately, his eyes drifted once more toward the range, following the invisible lines of wind that twisted between the markers, then settled again on the distant steel. Just one shot, he said. The simplicity of it landed differently this time. Not as a joke, not quite as a challenge either. Something else. Reynolds let out a quiet breath through his nose and glanced over his shoulder at the rest of the line. A few of the Marines had lowered their rifles, curiosity beginning to edge out amusement. One of them, Lance Corporal Ethan Brooks, had stopped smiling entirely. He was watching the old man with a focus that did not match the tone of the moment, his brow slightly furrowed, as if he were trying to place something he could not yet name. Reynolds noticed, but dismissed it quickly, turning back with a half grin that carried more edge now than humor. You know how far that target is? He asked, gesturing downrange. That is 980 yards. Most people here are still dialing that in with scopes and calculators. And you want to walk up and take a shot like it is nothing. The old man gave a small nod. Distance does not change much, he said. Wind does. A few of the Marines exchanged glances at that, the comment slipping past the surface of the conversation and settling somewhere deeper than expected. Reynolds felt it too, though he masked it quickly, rolling his shoulders and stepping back just enough to create space, to reassert control of the situation. All right, he said, louder now, bringing the attention fully back to himself. Let us say I humor this. Let us say I hand you a rifle. What happens when you miss? The question hung in the air, sharper than the laughter had been. It was not really about the shot. It was about drawing a line, about forcing the old man into a position where failure would be visible, undeniable, and final. The old man met his gaze without hesitation. Then I miss, he said. No explanation, no defense, just the acceptance of outcome. Reynolds blinked once, caught off guard again by the lack of resistance. He shifted his grip on the rifle, the weight of it suddenly more noticeable in his hands, as if it had become part of the moment instead of just a tool. Behind him, Brooks took a small step forward, his voice low but clear. Corporal, he said, maybe we should just. Reynolds cut him off with a quick glance, not harsh, but firm enough to end the suggestion before it could fully form. I have got this, he said. Brooks hesitated, then fell silent, though his eyes remained locked on the old man, tracking every movement, every stillness. Reynolds turned back, exhaling slowly, and for a brief second, his gaze dropped, not to the man's face, but to his chest, to the small, crooked badge pinned against the worn fabric of the jacket. Up close, it looked even less impressive. Tarnished, uneven, the edges slightly bent, as if it had been carried through years of wear without ever being replaced. It did not match any standard issue insignia he recognized. No rank, no unit marking he could immediately identify, just a piece of metal that seemed entirely out of place here. Reynolds reached out without thinking, the motion casual, almost dismissive, his gloved fingers brushing lightly against it. "What is this supposed to be?" he asked, the hint of a smirk returning, though it did not reach his eyes this time. The moment his fingers made contact, the old man's hand moved. Not fast, not aggressive, but deliberate enough to stop the motion. His grip was firm despite the age in it, steady in a way that did not match the rest of him. "Do not," he said quietly. 2 words. Soft, controlled, but they carried something that cut through the heat and the noise and the fading laughter like a line drawn in stone. Reynolds froze for just a fraction of a second, his hand still hovering near the badge, his expression shifting, the easy confidence cracking just enough to let something else through. Not fear. Not yet. But awareness. Around them, the range had gone quieter. Not completely silent, but the sound had changed. The casual rhythm of conversation had slowed, replaced by something more focused, more attentive. Even the wind seemed to pause between gusts, the flags hanging for a brief moment before shifting again in a different direction. Brooks felt it clearly now, the unease settling into his chest, the certainty that something here was not what it appeared to be. He glanced down at the badge, then back at the old man's face, and for the first time, a thought formed that he could not shake. This was not a visitor who had wandered into the wrong place. This was someone who had chosen to stand here. And that meant something. For a moment, nobody moved. The air itself seemed to tighten, stretched thin between the old man's quiet warning and the weight of a situation that had shifted without anyone quite understanding how. Corporal Jake Reynolds slowly pulled his hand back, the smirk that had once come so easily now gone, replaced by something more controlled, more guarded. He cleared his throat lightly, glancing to the side as if to reset the tone, to bring things back to where they had been just seconds ago. "All right," he said, forcing a small chuckle that did not quite land the same way it had before. "Relax. It is just a badge." But even as he said it, his eyes flicked back to it again, drawn in despite himself. Up close, the metal did not reflect the sun like standard issue insignia. It absorbed it. The surface was worn smooth in some places, rough in others, like it had been handled countless times, carried through years rather than displayed. There were faint markings etched into it, not sharp enough to read at a glance, but deliberate, intentional, not decorative. Something about it resisted being dismissed. Reynolds shifted his stance again, the gravel crunching under his boots louder now in the quiet, and lifted his rifle slightly as if to remind himself, and everyone else, where authority still rested. "You are not touching a weapon on this line," he said, more firmly this time. "That is not happening." The old man did not argue. He did not nod either. He simply stood there, his hand falling back to his side, the brief interruption already passed in his mind. His attention returned to the range, to the flags that had begun to move again, each one catching a slightly different current, the patterns subtle but consistent if you knew how to read them. "You are reading the first layer," he said quietly. "There is a second one just past 600 yards. It pulls right before it drops." Reynolds exhaled sharply through his nose, a hint of irritation breaking through now. "We have already compensated for that," he replied, though there was a fraction of hesitation in the way he said it, a barely noticeable pause that only someone paying close attention would catch. Behind him, Lance Corporal Ethan Brooks felt it clearly. He had been watching the same flags all morning, trying to reconcile what the instruments were telling him with what he thought he was seeing, and nothing had lined up cleanly. But what the old man had just said, the way he described it, matched something he had noticed but had not been able to articulate. Brooks took another step forward, slower this time, his voice careful. "Corporal," he said, he might be talking about the cross-current off the ridge. The one that, Reynolds cut him off again, sharper this time, the edge unmistakable. "I said I have got it," he snapped, then immediately softened his tone, aware of the shift, aware of the eyes on him. "We have procedures for a reason." Brooks stopped, nodding once, but his gaze did not leave the old man. The unease in his chest had grown into something heavier now, something that did not feel like simple curiosity anymore. It felt like recognition without a name. The old man glanced at Brooks briefly, just a flick of the eyes, but it was enough. There was no approval there, no acknowledgement, just a quiet understanding, as if he knew exactly what the younger Marine was seeing and why it mattered. Then his gaze moved on, back to the range, back to the distance. "You are overcorrecting," he added, almost as if continuing a conversation that no one else had agreed to have. Reynolds let out a short laugh, but there was no humor in it now. "And you are trespassing," he replied. "So we are both saying things the other does not need to hear." A few of the Marines shifted their weight, the earlier amusement now fully gone, replaced by a tension that sat low and steady, like pressure building before a storm. The sound of boots on gravel from farther down the line slowed, then stopped entirely as more attention drifted toward the exchange. The range officer, standing near the command post, had begun to watch more closely, his posture straightening slightly, though he had not yet stepped in. Reynolds noticed that too. He squared his shoulders, making a decision. "All right," he said, louder now, projecting confidence again, reclaiming the moment. "You want to stand here, you stand back there." He gestured with his rifle toward a point a few yards behind the firing line. "You do not interfere. You do not advise. And you definitely do not touch anything that does not belong to you." The old man looked at the indicated spot, then back at Reynolds. For a second, it seemed like he might refuse, like he might simply stay where he was and let the moment unfold differently. But then he stepped back. One pace. Slow. Deliberate. The gravel shifted under his boots again, softer this time, as if the ground itself was settling into a new arrangement. Reynolds nodded once, satisfied, turning back toward his lane. He brought the rifle up, settling into position, the familiar weight against his shoulder grounding him again, restoring a sense of control. Through the scope, the world narrowed to a distant shape, the steel target wavering in the heat. He adjusted for wind, dialing in what the instrument told him, what the training had drilled into him. But just before he took the shot, a thought slipped in, uninvited. Second layer. He hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. Behind him, the old man watched the flags shift again, the currents crossing in a pattern that had not changed in decades, only in location. Some things never really did change. You just had to know where to look. The rifle settled into Corporal Jake Reynolds's shoulder with practiced precision, the stock firm against his cheek, his breathing slowing as he aligned himself with the narrow world inside the scope. The chatter behind him had faded into a low hum, distant and irrelevant, replaced by the quiet discipline of focus. The target, nearly 1,000 yards out, wavered in the heat like a mirage, its edges bending and shifting. In the rising air, Reynolds adjusted his grip, steadying the barrel, his finger resting lightly against the trigger as he calculated the shot the way he had been trained to do. Wind speed, direction, distance, elevation. Numbers. Data. Clean and reliable. But the thought remained. Second layer. It lingered at the edge of his mind, unwelcome but persistent, threading through the calculations like a flaw he could not quite isolate. He exhaled slowly, letting half a breath out and holding the rest, the world narrowing further, the scope becoming everything. The flags downrange fluttered again, subtle but uneven, and for just a fraction of a second, his focus shifted from the numbers to the movement. It was not consistent, not clean. Something in the pattern did not match what the instrument had told him. His jaw tightened. He made a small adjustment. Just a fraction, barely noticeable. Behind him, Lance Corporal Ethan Brooks watched closely, his arms hanging loosely at his sides, his attention fixed not on the target, but on the man holding the rifle. He could see the hesitation, the slight delay that did not belong in a routine shot. Brooks had seen Reynolds shoot dozens of times. He was fast, confident, almost mechanical in execution. This was different. This was thought-interrupting instinct. A few feet farther back, the old man stood exactly where he had been told to stand, his posture unchanged, his hands relaxed at his sides. He was not watching Reynolds. Not directly. His eyes remained on the flags, tracking the invisible currents that shaped everything happening on that range. He did not speak. He did not need to. The information was already there. It always had been. Reynolds steadied himself again, forcing the distraction out, returning to the numbers, to the method. He adjusted his aim, aligning with what he trusted, what had been proven. The trigger broke clean. The sound cracked across the range, sharp and controlled, echoing briefly against the distant ridges before fading into the open air. For a moment, no one moved. All eyes shifted to the target, searching through the heat and distance for the result. A faint metallic sound followed a heartbeat later, not the solid, centered ring they were aiming for, but something lighter, off to the side. A glancing hit. Close, but not correct. The silence that followed was heavier than the laughter had been. It settled over the line, pressing down, forcing everyone to acknowledge what had just happened without saying it out loud. Reynolds lowered the rifle slowly, his expression tightening, the confidence from earlier replaced by something more restrained, more controlled. He did not look back immediately. He kept his eyes on the target for a second longer, as if willing it to change, as if the result might somehow correct itself if he held onto it long enough. It did not. Behind him, Brooks exhaled quietly, the confirmation settling into his chest. He had felt it coming, not because Reynolds was unskilled, but because something else had entered the equation, something they had not accounted for. Reynolds finally turned, the movement deliberate, his gaze sweeping briefly across the line before landing on the old man. There was no smirk this time, no easy confidence, just a question that had not yet been asked. The old man met his eyes for a moment, then shifted his gaze past him again, back to the range. "It pulls right before it drops," he said calmly. "You corrected too early." The words were not accusatory. They were not mocking. They were simply accurate. Reynolds held his stare for a second longer, then looked away, exhaling through his nose, the tension in his shoulders visible now. Around them, the Marines had gone quiet, the shift in atmosphere complete. This was no longer a joke, no longer a distraction. It was something else entirely, something that did not fit neatly into training or protocol. Brooks took another small step forward, his voice lower this time, more certain. "Corporal," he said, "let him take the shot." Reynolds did not respond immediately. His grip tightened slightly on the rifle, the weight of it suddenly different, heavier in a way that had nothing to do with the metal. He looked down at it, then back at the old man, then at the distant target that had just refused to cooperate. The wind shifted again, the flags catching it in a new pattern, subtle but clear to anyone willing to see it. For a long second, Reynolds stood there, caught between pride and something he could not yet define. Then, slowly, he turned, extending the rifle outward, not fully offering it yet, but no longer holding it entirely to himself. The movement was small, but it changed everything. The rifle hovered between them for a fraction longer than expected, suspended in a moment that felt heavier than the metal itself, as if the decision to let go carried more weight than the weapon ever could. Corporal Jake Reynolds held it there, his arm extended but not fully committed, his grip still firm enough to reclaim it if he chose to. The line of Marines watched without speaking, the earlier rhythm of the range completely gone now, replaced by a stillness that pressed in from all sides. Lance Corporal Ethan Brooks did not move, but his attention sharpened, his eyes shifting between Reynolds and the old man, sensing that whatever happened next would not just be about a shot. It would be about something far less visible and far more important. The old man did not reach for the rifle immediately. He looked at it first, not with desire, not with urgency, but with recognition. The same way someone looks at an object that has been part of their life long enough to stop being just a thing. Then his gaze lifted, meeting Reynolds again, measuring something unspoken, something that had nothing to do with rank or authority. "One shot," he said quietly. The same words as before, but now they carried a different weight. Reynolds exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing just enough for his grip to loosen. He released the rifle. Not dramatically, not ceremonially, just enough for it to shift from his control into the space between them. The old man stepped forward, closing the distance with a calm, deliberate pace, his boots pressing softly into the gravel. When he took the rifle, he did not adjust it right away. He held it for a moment, feeling the balance, the weight, the alignment. The modern design, the precision engineering, the clean lines of something built for a different generation. His fingers moved over it lightly, not inspecting, not judging, just acknowledging. Then he brought it up, smooth and unhurried, settling it into his shoulder with a motion so natural it seemed to erase the years from his posture. The shift was subtle, but it was there. His stance changed. Not larger, not stronger, just more certain, like a piece falling back into place after being set aside for too long. Brooks noticed at first, the way the old man's presence seemed to narrow the space around him, the way the casual observer became something else entirely the moment the rifle touched his shoulder. Reynolds saw it too, though he did not fully understand it. He crossed his arms, stepping back slightly, His expression guarded now, his earlier confidence replaced by a watchfulness he could not suppress. The old man did not look through the scope right away. His eyes remained open, scanning the range, tracking the flags, the terrain, the subtle shifts in light and movement that most people ignored. He tilted his head slightly, listening in a way that had nothing to do with sound. The wind moved again, brushing across the range in layered currents, each one carrying its own direction, its own intention. Finally, he lowered his gaze to the scope, aligning himself with the rifle. But even then, his movements were different. There was no rush, no visible calculation, no adjustment of dials or quick corrections, just a steady settling into position, as if the variables had already been accounted for long before he ever touched the weapon. Behind him, Brooks felt a chill run through his chest, the quiet certainty that he was watching something he did not fully understand but instinctively respected. One of the Marines farther down the line shifted his weight, the gravel crunching louder than it should have in the silence, then stilled again, as if even that small noise felt out of place now. Reynolds's eyes dropped briefly, almost involuntarily, to the old man's chest again, to the badge. It sat there, unchanged, dull and unassuming, but now it felt different. Not because it had moved, because everything else had. The old man exhaled slowly, letting the breath leave him in a controlled release, his body settling into stillness. The rifle became an extension of that stillness, not separate from it. For a moment, nothing happened. No shot, no movement, just a pause that stretched long enough to make the waiting itself feel significant. And then, almost imperceptibly, the flags shifted again. Not dramatically, not in a way that would draw attention from someone relying only on instruments, but enough for someone who had learned to see it without needing to measure it. The old man's finger rested against the trigger, not pressing, not tense, just present. The entire range seemed to hold its breath with him, caught in that single suspended second where outcome had not yet become reality. And in that silence, the difference between knowing and understanding became everything. The vehicle did not slow as it approached the outer edge of the range, its dark frame cutting through the heat haze with a purpose that did not belong to routine movement, and the low rumble of its engine rolled across the gravel and open ground in a steady, controlled growl that drew every eye, without a single word needing to be spoken. And Lance Corporal Ethan Brooks felt the shift immediately, his posture straightening almost on instinct. His attention pulled away from the old man and the rifle and locked onto the approaching figure of authority that was now impossible to ignore. While Corporal Jake Reynolds turned more slowly, the rifle still in his hands, his expression tightening again as the situation moved beyond his control in a way that no training scenario had prepared him for, and the rest of the Marines followed suit, the line subtly reorganizing itself, shoulders squaring, boots adjusting against the gravel, the quiet discipline returning not from command but from recognition, because everyone on that range understood what that kind of arrival meant even before the vehicle came to a full stop. And when it did, the engine cut cleanly, leaving behind a sudden silence that felt sharper than any order, the door opening with a firm, deliberate motion, and a man stepped out in a uniform that carried weight not because of how it looked, but because of what it represented. General Marcus Hale did not rush. He did not raise his voice. He simply stepped forward, his presence alone enough to shift the entire atmosphere of the range, his eyes moving once across the line, taking in the Marines, the positions, the rifle still held slightly out of place in Reynolds's grip, and then settling, without hesitation, on the old man standing a few paces back, and something changed in his expression, not visibly to most, but enough for Brooks to feel it, a tightening of focus, a recognition that came faster than understanding. And the general closed the distance with measured steps, each one precise, each one intentional, until he stood within clear view of the old man. And for a brief moment, neither of them spoke, the wind shifting lightly between them, catching the edge of the old jacket, brushing against the dull surface of the badge pinned to his chest, and the general's gaze dropped to it, just for a second, just long enough. And then he stopped completely, the movement so abrupt, so absolute, that it drew the attention of every Marine on the line, because something in that stillness was not normal, it was not procedural, it was something else, something heavier, and Reynolds felt it like a weight pressing into his chest, his grip tightening slightly on the rifle again. His mind racing to reconcile what he was seeing with what he thought he knew, because the man standing in front of him, the same one who had been laughed at minutes ago, was now the center of something he did not understand, and Brooks watched closely, his breath slow, his instincts telling him that the moment they had been building toward had finally arrived. And the general lifted his eyes again, meeting the old man's gaze directly, and there was no question in it, no uncertainty, only confirmation, as if he had just found something he had been looking for without realizing it. And when he spoke, his voice was low, controlled, but carried across the range with absolute clarity. "Sir," he said, and the word landed harder than any command that had been given all day, because it did not belong to the structure everyone on that line understood. It reversed it, and for a second, no one moved. No one even seemed to breathe, because the weight of that single word was impossible to ignore, and the old man did not react dramatically. He did not straighten or respond with formality. He simply inclined his head slightly, the same calm presence he had carried from the beginning unchanged, as if none of this surprised him, as if he had expected it all along. And Reynolds felt something shift inside him, something quiet but undeniable. The realization that the moment he had dismissed earlier was never what it seemed. And the badge, that small, worn piece of metal he had nearly brushed aside, now felt heavier in his mind than any insignia he had ever worn, and Brooks's eyes flicked between them. The connection clear now, even if the full story was not. And the general took one more step forward, his posture straightening just slightly, not for authority, but for something else entirely, something closer to respect. And the entire range seemed to hold its breath again, waiting for what would come next, knowing without needing to be told that whatever it was would change everything. The words still hung in the air, quiet but immovable, as if the entire range had shifted around it without anyone fully understanding how. And General Marcus Hale did not break eye contact as he took another step forward, his posture no longer that of a man arriving to inspect, but of someone standing before something far more significant. And the wind brushed lightly across the open ground, catching the edges of uniforms and flags alike. But no one moved to adjust, no one spoke, because the moment demanded stillness. And Corporal Jake Reynolds felt it most sharply, the weight of his earlier words pressing against him now with a clarity that made his grip on the rifle feel suddenly misplaced, almost intrusive, and without thinking, he lowered it slightly, not out of instruction, but out of instinct, as if something in him understood that he was no longer the one in control of this space. While Lance Corporal Ethan Brooks stood rigid, his breathing measured, his eyes fixed on the general and the old man, absorbing every detail, every shift in tone and posture, because this was no longer about a misunderstanding on a training range. This was something else entirely, something that reached beyond rank and procedure. And General Hale's gaze dropped once more to the badge, this time longer, studying it with a focus that was unmistakable, not curiosity, not confusion, but recognition layered with memory. And when he spoke again, his voice carried a different weight, quieter, but deeper. "I have not seen that insignia in a long time," he said, each word deliberate, each one landing with purpose. And the old man gave a slight nod, the same calm acceptance he had shown from the beginning, as if the passage of time meant little in the face of what that small piece of metal represented. And Brooks felt a chill settle deeper in his chest, because the way the general spoke was not how someone addressed a stranger. It was how someone acknowledged a history that did not need to be explained out loud. And Reynolds's eyes flicked again to the badge, his mind racing now, searching for anything that matched what he was hearing, anything that could justify the shift in authority he was witnessing. But nothing came. Only the growing realization that he had overlooked something important, something he had dismissed too quickly. And the general straightened fully then, his shoulders aligning with a precision that carried its own meaning. And for a brief second, the entire range seemed to align with him, the Marines instinctively adjusting their posture without command, as if responding to a signal they had not consciously received. And then, without raising his voice, without issuing an order, General Hale brought his hand up in a clean, deliberate motion, the salute sharp and exact, held with a level of respect that was impossible to mistake, and it landed like a shockwave through the line, not loud, not explosive, but absolute, because every Marine on that range understood what it meant for a man of his rank to initiate that gesture first, and for a fraction of a second. No one reacted, caught between training and disbelief, until Brooks moved, his body, responding before his mind could catch up, snapping into a salute of his own, his motion precise but carrying an undercurrent of something deeper than routine, and one by one, the rest followed, the line coming to attention not out of command but out of realization, until the entire range stood in silent formation, all eyes forward, all motion stilled, and Reynolds felt at last, the hesitation lingering for just a heartbeat longer than it should have, the memory of his earlier laughter still echoing faintly in his mind. But then he straightened, bringing his hand up, the movement sharp but heavier than it had ever been before, because now it carried understanding and respect and something close to regret. And through it all, the old man remained as he had been, standing quietly, not returning the salute immediately, not demanding recognition, simply present, his gaze steady, his posture unchanged, as if the weight of the moment did not need to be acknowledged because it had always been there. And after a second that felt longer than it should have, he lifted his hand slowly, returning the salute with a motion that was not as sharp, not as fast, but carried a depth that made the entire exchange feel complete, like something long overdue finally finding its place. And the wind moved again, softer this time, brushing across the range as if nothing had changed, even though everything had. And Brooks lowered his hand carefully, his chest tight with a realization he could not yet fully put into words, while Reynolds stood still for a fraction longer, his eyes fixed on the man in front of him, the badge, the posture, the silence, all of it combining into a single, undeniable truth. That respect was not something given lightly, and it was not something taken, it was something recognized, and in that moment, he knew he had witnessed it in its purest form. The words still hung in the air, quiet but immovable, as if the entire range had shifted around it without anyone fully understanding how. And General Marcus Hale did not break eye contact as he took another step forward, his posture no longer that of a man arriving to inspect, but of someone standing before something far more significant, and the wind brushed lightly across the open ground, catching the edges of uniforms and flags alike. But no one moved to adjust, no one spoke, because the moment demanded stillness, and Corporal Jake Reynolds felt it most sharply, the weight of his earlier words pressing against him now with a clarity that made his grip on the rifle feel suddenly misplaced, almost intrusive, and without thinking, he lowered it slightly, not out of instruction, but out of instinct, as if something in him understood that he was no longer the one in control of this space, while Lance Corporal Ethan Brooks stood rigid, his breathing measured, his eyes fixed on the general and the old man, absorbing every detail, every shift in tone and posture, because this was no longer about a misunderstanding on a training range. This was something else entirely, something that reached beyond rank and procedure. And General Hale's gaze dropped once more to the badge, this time longer, studying it with a focus that was unmistakable, not curiosity, not confusion, but recognition layered with memory. And when he spoke again, his voice carried a different weight, quieter, but deeper. "I have not seen that insignia in a long time," he said, each word deliberate, each one landing with purpose. And the old man gave a slight nod, the same calm acceptance he had shown from the beginning, as if the passage of time meant little in the face of what that small piece of metal represented. And Brooks felt a chill settle deeper in his chest, because the way the general spoke was not how someone addressed a stranger. It was how someone acknowledged a history that did not need to be explained out loud. And Reynolds's eyes flicked again to the badge, his mind racing now, searching for anything that matched what he was hearing, anything that could justify the shift in authority he was witnessing. But nothing came, only the growing realization that he had overlooked something important, something he had dismissed too quickly. And the general straightened fully then, his shoulders aligning with a precision that carried its own meaning. And for a brief second, the entire range seemed to align with him, the Marines instinctively adjusting their posture without command, as if responding to a signal they had not consciously received. And then, without raising his voice, without issuing an order, General Hale brought his hand up in a clean, deliberate motion, the salute sharp and exact, held with a level of respect that was impossible to mistake, and it landed like a shockwave through the line. Not loud, not explosive, but absolute, because every Marine on that range understood what it meant for a man of his rank to initiate that gesture first, and for a fraction of a second, no one reacted. Caught between training and disbelief, until Brooks moved, his body responding before his mind could catch up, snapping into a salute of his own, his motion precise but carrying an undercurrent of something deeper than routine, and one by one, the rest followed, the line coming to attention not out of command but out of realization, until the entire range stood in silent formation, all eyes forward, all motion stilled, and Reynolds felt at last, the hesitation lingering for just a heartbeat longer than it should have, the memory of his earlier laughter still echoing faintly in his mind. But then he straightened, bringing his hand up, the movement sharp but heavier than it had ever been before, because now it carried understanding and respect and something close to regret, and through it all, the old man remained as he had been, standing quietly, not returning the salute immediately, not demanding recognition, simply present, his gaze steady, his posture unchanged, as if the weight of the moment did not need to be acknowledged because it had always been there. And after a second, that felt longer than it should have, he lifted his hand slowly, returning the salute with a motion that was not as sharp, not as fast, but carried a depth that made the entire exchange feel complete, like something long overdue finally finding its place. And the wind moved again, softer this time, brushing across the range as if nothing had changed, even though everything had, and Brooks lowered his hand carefully, his chest tight with a realization he could not yet fully put into words, while Reynolds stood still for a fraction longer, his eyes fixed on the man in front of him, the badge, the posture, the silence, all of it combining into a single, undeniable truth, that respect was not something given lightly, and it was not something taken, it was something recognized, and in that moment, he knew he had witnessed it in its purest form.